Our topic this summer school is being Southern in an age of radicalism. I think we probably should have changed that to being Southern in an age of political correctness, because that's the name of the radicalism that we're dealing with. There's good and bad radicalism. I mean, there are good radicalisms that get down to the roots of things, and then there are radicalisms that destroy. So it's PC. Well, I'm going to talk about one part of that topic, namely Southern identity, and later I'll talk about ideology. One question you might ask yourself is, if you're not from the South, was not born and raised here, why should you even be thinking about Southern identity? I lived in the Midwest for some time, and there's a Midwestern identity. There's a Pacific Northwest Cascadian identity, a Southwestern identity in food and architecture and the like. But you're not going to have a conference with the title, Being Midwestern in an Age of Radicalism, or Being New England, a New Englander in an Age of Radicalism. New England is radicalism. So there's something funny about the South. And one thing about it is that the South, unlike any of those other regions, was once an independent country. That's unique. And there was the bloodiest war of the 19th century fought to prevent that country from being independent. That is a central event in American history. So nobody can avoid to think through that. If you're an immigrant coming here, you've got to try to think through that to see who you are going to be as an American. So I want to try to explain in this paper, indirectly more than directly, why one should be interested in Southern identity even if you're not raised here, and also why one can be a Southerner even if you weren't raised here. What does it mean to be a Southerner? We can say at least this, that a Southerner is a certain kind of American. I say a certain kind because, in other words, I didn't say a Southerner is an American. I said a Southerner is a certain kind of American. Because there were from the first, and still are, two incompatible visions of what America is and ought to be. I shall symbolize these incompatible Americanisms with the figures of Jefferson and Lincoln. And the reason these visions are incompatible is that they spring from two incompatible philosophical theories about the nature of man and political order. When you disagree philosophically, the disagreement is ultimate, because the categories of reason, evidence, and all are incommensurable. I shall take Aristotle to symbolize one of these visions of man and the nature of government, and the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes for the other. Jeffersonian Americans are in orbit around the Aristotelian vision, broadly conceived. Lincolnian Americans are in orbit around the Hobbesian version, broadly conceived. Now let's look at these two philosophic visions. In the Aristotelian view, man is a social animal, and political society is simply a natural historical development of that nature. The task of reason in this view is to preserve and perfect the traditions of political society. Perfect. For Hobbes, on the other hand, man is most emphatically not a social animal. He is thoroughly egoistic, a disposition which, if not restrained, leads to anarchy. It has to be restrained. So, in this view, political society is not natural. It's not going to happen naturally, like families are just going to happen naturally. Political society is artificial, and it happens only when a powerful will of an individual or group of individuals appears that is able to impose its will on a multitude and a territory and command obedience out of enlightened self-interest. So when William the Conqueror took over England, he made an offer they couldn't refuse. And they submitted out of self-interest, enlightened self-interest. Now, when that happens, we have the rudiments of government and law. The task of reason on this view is not to preserve an inherited tradition and perfect an inherited tradition of society. It's simply to keep collisions among egoistic individuals at a minimum, as in a regime of traffic regulations, where each individual is allowed to follow, if he follows the rules of the road, to pursue his own interests wherever they might lead without regard to anybody else. That's when you're driving a car and just follow the rules. We have peace. That's the Hobbesian view of politics. It's broadly, you can see, a liberal view or libertarian type view. But there's a further difference between Aristotle and Hobbes. Aristotle taught that everything in nature has a certain size and scale below which or beyond which it becomes dysfunctional. So political order should be at a human scale, and that means small. And should a number of small, and we'll talk about later about what small means, it's relative, but should a small polity find itself in a larger one for special purposes, such as defense or free trade, it must be possible for those polities to later secede if they so desire. They're natural things, so they should be able to cede or join as they desire. Not individuals, but whole societies. But for the Hobbesian, secession is ruled out absolutely. The reason is that no natural political society can be recognized in the Hobbesian regime. Within its border, there are only individuals in obedience to a central authority, as with traffic regulations, or baseball for that matter. The umpire has final say. So if one group of individuals could secede, so could another group, and part of that group, and part of that group, on down to the dissolution of all government. So secession is absolutely prohibited in the Hobbesian regime because it would subvert all notions of law, government, and authority. But that's because political society is artificial. If it were natural, you'd get a quite different conclusion, and that's what Aristotle comes to. But while the Hobbesian state cannot be divided by secession, there is no internal limit to its growth and expansion. The reason is that its sole purpose is to push back the dark forces of anarchy and expand the sphere of civil association. So the larger the regime, the better, because you've got a larger sphere of civil association for individuals. To sum up, and then we'll come to Jefferson and Lincoln. For the Aristotelian, political society is a natural, organic, historically developing thing. It must be relatively small, and should it voluntarily enter a larger society for limited purposes, it should also be free to exit if desired. For the Hobbesian, political order is not natural, but is the work of an artificially imposed will that can define the limits of its own power. There is no internal limit as to how large it can become, and secession is ruled out absolutely. Now, when confronted with the secession of 11 American states, Lincoln, in his first inaugural, justified war on the grounds that, and I quote, "Secession is the essence of anarchy," end quote. So he's right on schedule with the Hobbesian vision. That was the knee-jerk reaction. Absolutely unthinkable. But when Jefferson was confronted with the prospect, really serious prospect of New England secession, only 40 years before, and he had confronted in 1804, 1808, 1814, I mean, New England was never really happy. Jefferson said, quote, "If any state declares it prefers separation to union, I have no hesitation in saying, let us separate, end quote. You see the difference? The constitutional conflict between Jefferson and Lincoln is mirrored in the deeper philosophical conflict between Aristotle and Hobbes. Now, the American founders wanted to enjoy republican government, something that was very rare in Europe. But the Republican tradition was Aristotelian, and it taught that republics had to be small. How small? One of the largest republics in ancient Greece was Athens, with around 200,000 people. But most republics throughout history were under 200,000 people. Florence, for example, a leader in the Renaissance, was around 60,000. The Republican tradition also taught that if the territory of a republic was large, or became too large, it would inevitably succumb to centralization and would die as a republic. The classic example was Rome, which gained too much territory and population and collapsed into a monarchical empire, though it still continued to use the language of republicanism. The Senate and the people of Rome. You can see it today in the sewers in Rome. S-P-U-Q-R-Q. And you can see it in the United States. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, given the size of its territory, America seemed doomed at the outset to repeat the tragedy of Rome. How could this be prevented? It was just too big. But only in territory. In population, it was very republican. It had a human scale even greater than that of ancient Greece. The largest city in America in 1776 was Philadelphia, with only 30,000 people. So America was made up of these small Protestant communities, but huge territory. The answer was Virginia led the way. Virginia had conquered the vast Northwest Territory, what became today the states of Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, and parts of Michigan. Leaders in the House of Burgesses in Virginia argued that Virginia could not both remain a republic and govern such extensive territory. So it was decided to cede the Northwest Territory to the Confederation as common property, to be divided into states when filled with sufficient population. Lead us not into temptation. So Virginia escaped monarchy by division. But Virginia was still too large. So the western counties seceded and formed the state of Kentucky. Likewise, Tennessee seceded the western counties of North Carolina and formed the state of Tennessee. First, they formed the state of Franklin, which failed, but eventually Tennessee came out of it. Maine seceded from Massachusetts, and so it went. America would remain republican by repeated acts of secession and division as population increased. But Jefferson thought that even without Kentucky, Virginia was still too large. He proposed dividing the state into what he called, quote, ward republics, which would have autonomy over local matters. He wrote, quote, "The wit of man cannot devise a more solid basis for a free, durable, well-administered republic." In other words, Virginia would be made up of little states like Switzerland. Switzerland, for example, is a little over half the size of South Carolina. Let that soak in. But it has 26 sovereign states, not counties, sovereign states. These have their own welfare laws, immigration laws, their own military. These states range from 16,000, how you like that, to 1 million. The average size is 300,000, and most are under 200,000. Switzerland has maintained its independence since 1291, and though landlocked, it has one of the highest per capita incomes in the world. So he's thinking of something like Switzerland. Jefferson wrote Joseph Cable, or Cabell, how do you say it, Cabell? Cabell. In February 1816, he said, as Cato concluded every speech with the words, Carthage must be destroyed, so do I, with every opinion with the injunction, divide Virginia into ward republics. So there was Jefferson. By the way, the Swiss Constitution of 1848 was modeled pretty much on the U.S. Constitution as it was going on then. But when Jefferson acquired the Louisiana Purchase territory, which doubled the size of the United States, it was already too big, the threat posed by great size became worse. New England states threatened secession immediately, arguing that Virginia aimed to be, quote, the Austria of America, end quote. Jefferson agreed that America would be an empire and was becoming an empire, but he said it would not be a centralized empire like Rome. Instead, it would be what he called, quote, an empire of liberty, end quote. An empire of liberty. What is that? What he meant was this. As population moved west, the primordial scene of the first Americans would be reenacted. Forests would be cleared, societies built, and when strong enough, they would secede and form their own states. In time, the original Union of States would itself become too large for self-government, in which case it too would divide into two or more federations of states. This is naturally, it's just going to happen, unless someone messes it up. Jefferson thought a natural division in the future would be an Atlantic Confederation on the East Coast, a Mississippi Federation along the Mississippi River, and a Pacific Federation. So when 11 southern states called their people in constitutional conventions and seceded from the Union, they were simply following the lawful method of preserving republicanism in the only way it could be preserved in an American territory of continental size. Size. Too big. Namely by division and through secession. Lincoln, too, aimed at forming an empire, but it would be a centralized empire, a Hobbesian empire. Once a state entered that American empire, it could never leave. It forever lost its character as a republic and dissolved into an aggregate of individuals under central authority. As in ancient Rome, the language of republicanism would survive in Lincolnian America, and there would be talk of states' rights. But central authority would have the final say on what those rights are. It could define the limits of its own power and that of the states. Now, you and I have all inherited both of these traditions. And if you're like me, you grew up inheriting them both without thinking of what they were. So you grew up in a muddle. I did, so. The Jeffersonian Aristotelian tradition and the Lincolnian Hobbesian tradition. And this forces us to ask the question, since these views are incommensurable, you can't sort of mix them together. They're unstable compounds. They explode if you do that. We have to ask ourselves, to which of these visions are we to give our allegiance? Are you a Lincolnian American or a Jeffersonian? But there's a problem in even raising this question because American historians since 1865 have retrospectively read Lincolnian nationalism along with the Hobbesian philosophical presuppositions back into the founding period, so that the whole of Jeffersonian America has been Lincolnized. You don't want to be Lincolnized. Did you see what I mean? And this is understandable because if you've got this great nation, you've got to write a history of it, and you certainly don't want to be talking about its opposite, or its. And so in this view, the historians say pretty much America was from the first a unitary state, one and indivisible. And the American story is how patriots fought to protect America from the subversive forces of anarchy that sought to overthrow it, the most serious of which was the South, which seceded and made war on the United States. But this story has it just backwards. America is not a story of continuity. It's a story of discontinuity. There really was a Jeffersonian America that flourished from 1776, that's when I date it, to 1861. Indeed, it was the founding America and was overthrown by the Lincolnian Revolution, which through invasion and conquest replaced it with a French Revolutionary-style unitary state, the very kind of state from which the Americans of 1776 seceded. They did not want that sort of state. But now they're going to get it, 70 years later. So what was Jeffersonian America like? And that's what I want to talk about now. Was there such a thing as Jeffersonian America? What was it like? The first thing to appreciate is that Southerners were arguably the most important in shaping and sustaining this America. Virginia was the most important state in winning independence and in framing the Constitution. A Southerner, St. George Tucker of Virginia, wrote the first work on the Constitution. Senator John Taylor of Virginia wrote a number of insightful works in political economy exposing and explaining the efforts to turn the central government into a scene of patronage and crony capitalism. And Calhoun was the first American to work out a systematic political philosophy. Lord Acton placed it in his list of the 100 best books ever written. From 1789 to 1860, From 1789 to 1860, Southern presidents dominated. In the first 63 years of the Federation, only 16 saw the election of Northern presidents. Only 16. And if William Crawford had not had a stroke during his election or campaign, he survived, but it weakened it, he would have probably beaten John Quincy Adams. And that means in the first 67 years, there's just been 12 years of Northern presidents. Amazing. During the first 72 years, 5 Southern presidents served 2 terms. No Northern president ever served 2 terms. And even most of the few Northern presidents inclined to Jeffersonian principles. Franklin Pierce and Jefferson Davis were lifelong friends. And President James Buchanan argued in 1860 that the central government had no authority to coerce a seceding state. He didn't think they should secede, but nothing he could do about it. Of attorney generals, 14 came from the South, only 5 from the North. Supreme Court justices, 17 to 11. Speakers of the House, 21 to 12. All the territory beyond the original 13 states was acquired by Southern administrations, and Southerners were the leaders in exploring the constitutional and philosophic grounds of this unprecedented adventure in republicanism on a continental scale. That had never happened before. Republicanism was always confined to small territory. Except for Switzerland, that was small. So the United States is doing something absolutely unprecedented. So as of 1860, when you thought of America, you thought mainly of Southerners. I mean, that was what you mainly thought of. Andrew Jackson, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, the Alamo, Davy Crockett. What was Jefferson America like when these Southerners were pretty much running the show? Well, from the first, there were dissenting American Hobbesians who admired the new European system of centralized states and wanted to create an American version. Hamilton was one of these. He described the Constitution, quote, as a frail and worthless fabric. Worthless. Why? Because it was a compact between the states, creating a central government with limited power, not a unitary state. Hamilton was the mentor of Henry Clay, and Henry Clay was the acknowledged mentor of Lincoln. So you had this Hobbesian dissent from the first. We want to be like Britain. We don't want to be ruled by Britain, but we want the British sort of system here. How to prevent this was the Jeffersonian problem. The solution for the Jeffersonians was to control, it's very simple, control the central government's ability to raise and spend money. You're not going to get crony capitalism if there's just no money to dole around, to play around with. On this, Hamilton and Jefferson immediately crossed swords. Hamilton wanted to charter a national bank and create a public debt, which would form a tight connection between the wealthy and the central government, where the wealthy would finance government, and government would pass legislation that benefited politically favored businesses. In short, Hamilton openly favored a national system of crony capitalism. See, I call it crony capitalism. He would say, no, it's a good thing because you need the wealthy to fund the government, to do the things we want to do. But Jefferson saw that this would destroy republicanism in the states and local committees. Now, you got to remember, republicanism was not a feature of the central government. We forget about that. We talk about the American Republic and we mean the central government. Absolutely absurd. The Constitution says every state is guaranteed a Republican form of government. A federation of country clubs is not a country club, is it? A federation of florist shops is not a florist shop. It's a different kind of thing. It's important, but it's not a florist shop and it's not a republic if it's a federation of republics. The federal government is a compact, an artificial compact between the country clubs or the florist shops or the states. But you can see the Hamiltonians are thinking of it as a republic. The founders of the Philadelphia Convention also thought that chartering corporations would destroy republicanism in the states and local community where alone it exists. And so they forbade the central government having the right to charter corporations. We've got to remember that. When Washington sided with Hamilton on chartering a national bank, Jefferson resigned in disgust and went into opposition. He explained to Madison how the states, even now, even after Congress had passed the law, could still protect their own citizens from the tyranny their national bank would inevitably encourage. And he argues as follows. He tells Madison to argue as follows, quote, this is wonderful. The power of erecting banks and corporations was not given to the general government. It remains then with the state itself. They can form corporations, but not the general government. For any person to recognize a foreign legislature, that is Congress, a foreign legislature, in a case belonging to the state itself, is an act of treason against the state. And anyone acting under the authority of a foreign legislature, whether by signing notes, issuing or passing them, acting as director, cashier, or in any other office, shall be adjudged guilty of high treason and suffer death accordingly, end quote. There. These are sovereign states. You can have your national bank, but we're not going to cooperate. That's what California did with medical marijuana. Congress said it's illegal. Supreme Court upheld it. They said, forget it. We're not, you know, it's our power. We're going to do it. And they did. And Congress couldn't do anything about it. Or they tried, but they didn't have the ATF didn't have the budget to carry it out. You know, they said, California said, come on in and enforce it. We need you to enforce it, but we're not going to enforce it. So. Okay, so President Adams continued the centralizing policies of Hamilton. Jefferson ran for president on a platform of state sovereignty and strict construction and said that if he were elected, he would abolish all inland federal taxes. He won, and from 1800 to 1861, there were no inland taxes except for a brief period to pay for the War of 1812. The expenses of the central government were paid mainly by a tariff on imports and to a lesser extent by land sales. Jefferson, as president, sought to get the country out of debt. He failed, but another Jeffersonian, Andrew Jackson, succeeded. From 1834 until 1861, the U.S. had virtually no debt, except $65 million for the Mexican War, and that was less than the expense of the federal government in 1858. So, from 1800 to 1861, the Jeffersonian system, based on state sovereignty and decentralization, ruled the country. There had never been anything like it. Here was the real American exceptionalism. You know all this talk about American exceptionalism? It's not. America is just like the European states in this, but this is real exceptionalism. Europeans were under centralized regimes of crony capitalism, and they paid heavy taxes. They were loaded with massive debts and endless wars. Under the Jeffersonian regime, Americans were virtually free of inland federal taxes, had a negligible debt, and the sword was in the hands of the state militias. Not Washington, not the commander-in-chief. With the exception of England, per capita American wealth was greater than in Europe. Its literacy rate was the highest in the world. And though still largely a frontier country, it was beginning to make a mark in the arts and sciences. But it wasn't just that the central government was frugal in taxes and debt. The state governments were generally frugal too. As of 1860, most states, now listen to this, had passed constitutional amendments against the states chartering corporations. Why? Because they had done it and it was led to crony capitalism. They said, this is sick. They had the authority to do it, but the central government did not have the authority to do it, and even they gave up that authority. Lead us not into temptation. As of 1860, American citizens enjoyed more individual and political liberty than any people in the world then or since. That's my claim, and I'll defend it against all comers. I might not be able to do it, but I think you can. It was an amazing achievement. That was Jeffersonian America. That was not a utopia, not a philosopher's utopia. It actually existed. No, now, the slaves were another problem, but they weren't citizens, and many of the Indians weren't citizens either. That's a special discussion. I'm talking about citizens. Nowhere in history can we find a central government in a large territory in a condition of increasing prosperity and expansion that does not steadily increase its ability to tax and spend, much less one that is energetic and expansive, and yet actually reduces spending. Where do you ever see this? But that was true of Jeffersonian America. The public debt after the Revolution was 77 million. 70 years later, it was 65 million. Yet during that period, the Union grew in wealth and through purchase and conquest expanded to 3 times its size, eventually reaching the Pacific. It fought 2 major wars. instituted the Industrial Revolution, and during that period under Southern leadership, the central government actually reduced its power to tax and spend. Good old USA. But not after 1865. It's going to be different. Look at this. When Lincoln entered office, the debt was $65 million. When he left, it was $2.6 billion. And he wiped out the wealth of the South with what he bought with that money. If Jeffersonian America was a flourishing empire, why did the South secede? So great, why did they secede? The short answer is because a revolution that began in the North. The ruling class of the North was exploring the new opportunities opened up by the Industrial Revolution. No one knew what this thing was, the Industrial Revolution. They didn't have a name. They didn't call it the Industrial Revolution. And they began to think of America not as a federation of sovereign states, but as a unitary state like France or Britain, where the central government could fix the limits of its own power and was authorized to charter and subsidize politically well-connected businesses for the public good. The South wanted no part of this regime, which was opposed to its economic and political interests, but also was unconstitutional. Many Americans agreed, and 60% of Americans voted against Lincoln and the Republican Party. That shows you the strength of Jeffersonian America, the Democratic Party, particularly in the North. Because remember, it was Northerners that put these Southerners in power all that time. And a lot of them were opposed to this, and were mad as hell that the South had left them stuck with the Republican Party. Once the Republicans were in power, and the South was no longer there to check centralization and crony capitalism, the Northern ruling class plunged into an orgy of crony capitalism and corruption known as the Gilded Age. The plunder and corruption almost defies belief, given the prior standards of political conduct in Jeffersonian America. I don't have time to go into all of that, but I'll just mention two, to me, spectacular bits of corruption. The central government gave land to the railroad companies in an amount twice the territorial size of Germany. Get that? And all the mineral rights underneath. It's for the public good. You opposed to the public good? The second is the first great federal boondoggle. Clyde Wilson put me onto this. Pensions for Union veterans. Those eligible for pensions and their relatives steadily increased and were used as bribes for votes needed to keep high tariffs and other special interests. The high tariffs, of course, hurt the South and the West, too, as far as agriculture goes. They even passed retroactive bonuses of $1,000 given to veterans who had never applied and who had not been wounded, at a time when the average annual wage for industrial workers was $400. So you get this $1,000 bonus. You know who to vote for? In 1893, pensions were 40% of the federal budget. When the program ended in 1942, the cost had run to nearly $8 billion. That was about 3 times the cost of the war to the North, which was $2.3 billion. Grover Cleveland from New Jersey, who was the last Jeffersonian president, and where's our man here who wrote a book on Grover Cleveland? Ryan Walters back there. And it's called The Last Jeffersonian, isn't it? Great book. Well, Cleveland was one of those northerners of Southern principles from New Jersey. No doubt the southern part of New Jersey. The Garden State. Not the northern part, which is the chemical industry state. But anyway, but Grover Cleveland was a great man, and his studies showed in 1885 that 1/4 of the claims were fraudulent. But I mean, this is to be expected. You're just going to, you know, Medicaid. Once you get these big things going, that's the way it is. Now, none of these pensions went to Confederates. Yet the impoverished South had to pay taxes for inflated Yankee pensions as well as the meager ones they received from their state governments. And they were paid to black and white Confederate soldiers. The South seceded not to protect slavery, something Americans have a deep need to believe, but to continue enjoying the founding Jeffersonian Americanism they had done so much to create and sustain in practice and philosophically. That's why they seceded. They wanted to just keep on doing what they had always done and what their fathers had ratified. How do we know this? Read the Confederate Constitution. The Confederate Constitution explains why they seceded. They wanted to enjoy government so described. Now, what was the Confederate Constitution? It was nothing new. It was simply the Constitution of the United States, word for word, except for a few changes. What were those changes? The changes were designed to prevent the centralizing interpretations that Northern nationalists such as Judge Story, Daniel Webster, and Lincoln were using to say that this was a unitary state and not a federation of states. So they were not revolutionaries. They just took the old Constitution and reformed it. Let me just give you a brief look at some of these reforms. First, the Confederates sought to prevent the central government from becoming a scene of crony capitalism by limiting spending. 2/3 vote of both houses was required for a spending bill. It's going to make it difficult, except for a special request from the president, which they didn't have to act on. And the president was given the line item veto and 1 6-year term. Second, the central government was forbidden to subsidize private enterprise and to fund projects to improve national infrastructure like railroads, canals. The government, however, could provide funds to facilitate commerce as cleaning out harbors, building lighthouses, but it would be refunded by those who use the facilities. Third, a tariff on imports was prohibited. Isn't it hot in here? Is there any way to turn this air conditioning up? See if you can. The tariff had been a bone of contention, and there are historians who say that the tariff was not important in secession. Well, read the Confederate Constitution. They outlawed tariff on imports. Must have been pretty important. It's one of the few reforms they made. Fourth, the power of the states to resist federal tyranny was strengthened. With 2/3 vote of both houses of the state legislature, the state could impeach any federal official operating in the state's territory to be tried in the Confederate Senate. Any federal judge, think about the Ninth Circuit, any federal judge, any federal dog catcher, IRS agent could be impeached. 2/3 of the state. So you'd have to air these corruptions. The state of Iowa could just, there's an impeachment trial of the IRS agent operating in Iowa. Well, that would have a chilling effect. Fifth, 2/3 of both houses of Congress was necessary to admit a state to the Union. 2/3. It's going to be hard to get in the Union. In the U.S., it took only a majority of Congress, and that was a stupid rule, and it brought on the Civil War. I think that's not an exaggeration, because it suddenly created new majorities and new minorities. You're a majority, and all of a sudden now you're a minority. By one vote, a state could come in. Had this Confederate rule been in place, Missouri, Louisiana, Texas, and other states would probably never have been admitted. There's no way New England ever would have admitted Texas. John Quincy Adams argued secession over Texas, and secession was argued over the admission of Louisiana. So those states would have stayed out. They couldn't have gotten in. And that would have been a good thing, because it would have brought out in the open the real, serious gut differences that had to be accommodated. Whereas with the majority rule, the state comes in and we paper it over, we're all Americans and all of that sort of thing. You don't confront the real issues. So if those states had not been admitted, what would have happened? They're going to be states. You would have to decide what to do. Okay, we'll have two federations. What about that? They've done it before. The Constitution, Article 7, says only 9 states are needed to form the United States. So if only 9 seceded and joined the United States, the other 4 would be under the Articles. There'd be 2 federations. They've done it before. Those 4 did decide, but they didn't have to. So the Confederate Constitution was wiser. They had learned. 5, the most important reform of all, I think, was that any 3 states could propose an amendment to the Constitution, and only 2/3 of the states were needed to ratify it. Think of that. Any 3 states could propose an amendment, want to abolish the House of Representatives and the Senate, have a unicameral legislature. Well, you'd have to vote on it. It'd be voted down, but so the states would have a lot of say as to what's constitutional, not the Supreme Court. By contrast, the U.S. Constitution practically shuts the people out. Look at how we can amend it. Congress can initiate an amendment by 2/3 vote of both houses. Fine. Since 1790, there have been over 10,000 amendments proposed. How many have gotten past the gate? 30. And 27 have been ratified. It is practically impossible to amend the Constitution today through Congress. Practically impossible. Certainly in any way to strengthen the states. The second way is that 2/3 of the states can force Congress to call a convention to consider amendments. And that has never been tried. One reason is that people are afraid of what will happen. The convention anything could be proposed, and people are afraid of what might happen. So, let's amend the Constitution. Sure, yeah, Utterly silly. We've just gotten ourselves in a position where there's just very little self-government. The Confederate Constitution remedies that. 3 states can start a debate. You have to vote it up or down. People have to confront the issues that these states bring up. Abortion, have to confront it. Gay marriage, you have to so-called same-sex marriage, you have to confront it. One of my gay friends said, once people started using the terms gay marriage, it was over with. We had won. So-called same-sex marriage. Okay. I won't go through it. There were other changes in the Confederate Constitution. I won't mention them. I'll just accept to say the preamble makes it clear that the Confederate States is a compact between the states. It says every state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and that means it can secede. As to slavery, there's hardly any difference between the U.S. Both abolished the slave trade. The Confederacy, like the U.S., left abolition up to the states, and the Confederacy allowed the existence of non-slaveholding states. One difference is the Confederate Constitution required that Congress pass laws to enforce the ban on the slave trade, Jefferson Davis's first veto was a law to sell the slaves of a captured Yankee slave trader. I can't say 61, I think, because it was unconstitutional for the Confederate government to engage in the slave trade. So the Confederate Constitution is the most refined expression of Jeffersonian America. From that America from 1776 to 1861, you look at the mentality of it, the Confederate Constitution is the most thoughtful, refined expression of that America, North and South. Remember that America was as much North as it was South. Southerners dominated, but they were put there by Northerners. After the war, the North would be defined as America. And the America that existed before, well, the principles of secession and nullification, which were part of what was meant by liberty in America from 1776 to 1861, state nullification and secession were part of what Americans meant by political liberty, the liberty of the states. That was now defined as a Southern heresy after the war. It's a Southern heresy. Has nothing to do with America. America had never had anything to do with secession or nullification. So what were Jeffersonian principles of America, you see, of that older America, now were classed as Southern heresies by this wicked group of people that committed treason against the United States, the last best hope on earth. And so this is a history we've inherited. So now the North would define itself as America, and it was set about rewriting history to legitimate that claim. Now this suppression, and so it would have to suppress all the knowledge of Jeffersonian America. I don't mean to say there was anything perverse about that. It's just historians have to leave out something, so why not leave that out if you're writing a national history? But this suppression of the South goes back much before that, and I want to talk about that right now. It began in New England. Shortly after the War of 1812, when it seemed likely that Southerners would forever dominate the Union, remember all those Southerners that were running things? The New England elites concluded that if they could not dominate the Union politically, and they were not going to be able to do that, they would dominate it culturally. They would redefine the nation, they would redefine law, they would redefine republicanism, they would redefine happiness, they would redefine everything in accordance with New England ideology. Now there are two books on this that you might want to read. Harlow Shidley, titled Sectional Nationalism, Massachusetts Conservative Leaders and the Transformation of America. Sectional Nationalism, Massachusetts Conservative Leaders, and the Transformation of America. And the other book is by Susan Mary Grant, called North over South. Northern Nationalism and American Identity in the Antebellum Period. Grant shows that by the 1850s, the negative images that New Englanders created, clerics, pundits, journalists, travel literature, novelists, it's interesting that the New Englanders constantly wrote this travel literature. They would go down and look at them. I mean, there's no Southern travel literature up to New England. Southerners going up there and saying, what are these people? They would go months, even years, without even thinking of New England. But in Boston, they thought about it, the South, all the time. All the time. When Calvin went to sleep, they were staying up late at night writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. Grant says that by 1850s, these negative stereotypes of the South were stereotypical and had poisoned the minds of many in the South. In the North. She didn't say poison, I say poison. The attack, it should be pointed out, was not on the immorality of slavery, but on the South as an existential reality and a threat to the true America. It was the Southern people themselves that were dehumanized. What's his name? Caleb Strong says Southerners are, quote, a race of lazy, ignorant, coarse, sensual, swaggering, sordid, beggarly barbarians. Now, this language is typical. And it's as purple as it gets. The New York Times described Southerners as, quote, intolerant, domineering, and insolent, not occasionally, nor by accident, but habitually and on principle, end quote. Horace Mann, founder of public education in America, said of Southerners that without the light reflected from New England educated communities, quote, they would all be heathens and cannibals. Am I making that noise? Boom. I guess I am. They would be heathens and cannibals. Wendell Phillips said, quote, the North thinks. It can appreciate argument. It is the 19th century, whereas the South dreams. It is the 13th and 14th century, end quote. He never went up against Calhoun or Jefferson. The struggle between North and South was a struggle, they said, between, quote, barbarism and civilization, between, quote, the corporal and the spiritual nature of man. You cannot exaggerate this literature. And it goes on for some 40 years. And it's sunk deeply into the American consciousness, and it's still there. But let's look at the matter. Let's just see how far off the mark this ritualistic denunciation is. And by the way, very few of these people ever really went south and long enough to try to understand it, and most of them saw what they wanted to see. Consider economic productivity. Robert Fogel, a Nobel laureate in economics, and Stanley Ingerman co-authored a book titled Time on the Cross, which I highly recommend, a study of the economics of the Old South. They argue that considering equal output for equal input, Southern free farms were 9% more efficient than Northern farms. Southern plantations were 28% more efficient. Southern plantations were 28% more productive than Southern free farms, and 40% more productive than Northern farms. So the plantation was extremely a productive thing. The authors argue that the high productivity of the plantation was achieved not by driving slaves with the crack of the lash until they dropped, but by educating them and by providing pecuniary and other incentives for achievement. He gives examples of plantations that were entirely run by the slaves. They bought the seed, they planted, they harvested, they marketed the stuff, they collected the money, and then the planter got a share. Now, there probably were not too many of those, but he does mention some. Second, the South was not poor, and this is another thing that's extraordinary. The per capita wealth of the South, if slaves were included, and they should be, was the highest in America. The highest. Working with the 1860 census, William Cawthon, he died recently. He was working on his PhD at Georgia, never finished it, like some other people we might think about. But he calculated the per capita wealth of the North and South. He did it this way. He divided the number of free people in a county with the wealth of that county. And he went through every county in the United States. What he found was that Mississippi was the richest state with a per capita wealth of $2,128. South Carolina was second with 2,017. This was close to 3 times the wealth of Connecticut, the richest northern state. Its per capita wealth was $771, as opposed to 2,128. 12 southern states had per capita wealth greater than any northern state. 12 southern states had per capita wealth greater. Arkansas, the lowest southern state, had a per capita wealth of 811 compared to New York's of only 597. The North also had a greater number of poor counties than the South. Wealth distribution in the South was less equal than in the North, but not by much. If slaves are counted as income earners, the top 12 states are all Southern except for Connecticut, which would be 5th, New Jersey, Oregon, and Delaware, which would be 9th, 10th, and 11th. This is important because the eventual transition from slavery to emancipation would be very expensive and would require considerable social trust. The South had the wealth to pay for that transition for emancipation, and it had 2 centuries of experience of reciprocal relations in a biracial society with which to better effect a morally agreeable transition. The North's policy was to keep free blacks out of the North and South. Lincoln opposed slavery going west because he said keeping them out would save the region from what he called the, quote, troublesome presence of free Negroes. Troublesome presence. The 1860 value in slaves was $3 billion, a greater investment than all the railroads and factories in the North. By invading the South, destroying 60% of its capital, killing a quarter of its men of military age, and wiping out $3 billion of investment without compensation, and destroying its currency, and repudiating its national debt, Lincoln effected an emancipation in the worst way under the worst possible conditions. Try to imagine conditions worse than that. The great emancipator. Third, it is true the South did not industrialize at the rate of the North, but that is because it didn't need to. Its competitive advantage was agriculture. It was an exporter. And it had an excellent system of rivers and waterways for transportation. But it industrialized when it wanted to and needed to. In 1830, Charleston, South Carolina, produced the first commercially successful railroad in America. It was called the Best Friend of Charleston. It ran 136 miles, and at that time it was the longest rail line in the world. As of 1860, the South had more miles of railroad than any country in the world, except the North. Its economy was the 4th largest in the world, and it surpassed France, Germany, and other countries in textile manufacturing. Italy did not reach the South's rate of economic growth until the mid-20th century. Think of what the New Englanders were saying about this region and how it is stuck. The book by Fogel and Engelman is very helpful in this. Read it, Time on the Cross. Let's look at education. Here's where the Yankees really are having hallucinations. According to Frank Owsley, quote, the South had more educated men and women in proportion to white population than the North, or any part of the world. The 1860 census shows that there was one college student for every 247 white inhabitants in the South, but there was one for only every 703 in the North. In other words, there were 3 times as many college students in the South as there was in the North. Not twice, 3 times. The first college in the world chartered to give women advanced degrees was Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, 1836. Although the South had only a third of the North's white population, its 260 colleges represented half the total of the United States. South Carolina College, now the University of South Carolina, built, and Jim Kibler is responsible for these facts, built the first separate college library building in the United States in 1839. It had the largest collection of non-theological volumes of any American college library. And it had more books than Harvard. Moreover, a private lending library nearby had more books than the college had. Uneducated people, uncivilized, hallucination. But it's thought of as fact. Fact. Michael O'Brien of Oxford University, who recently passed away, has spent a career demonstrating that Southerners produce an intellectual culture the equal to anything in the North. This, of course, has not filtered down to the general public, though historians who are honest know about it. Rich planters, especially those of South Carolina, sent their sons to Eton, Oxford, and the Middle Temple. Of the 350 Americans admitted to the Inns of Court in London before 1860, nearly two-thirds were from the South. Southerners made up half the students at the University of Berlin, American contingent students. The great 19th century classical scholar, Basil Gildersleeve, that Bill has given talks on, was from Charleston. Appears to be the first American to receive a doctorate from a German university. Northern schools, such as Yale and Harvard, had large contingents of Southerners. Calhoun was elected valedictorian of his class at Yale. Nearly half the students at Princeton in 1850 came from the South. So Southern identity, well, one other thing I'll just mention, that from the earliest days, Southern schools stressed study of the Greek and Latin classics in the original languages, whereas the North began abandoning the classics as early as the 17th century in favor of theological literature and later of scientific and ideological. And this, some people argue, explains why the Southerners were so persuasive politically, because they were eloquent. Okay, the South was not simply a region. The South, unlike the rest of the country, was once an independent country. It is the historic bearer of the most articulated form of Jeffersonian America, which many of us consider the most noble part of America. Those outside the South, whether on the left or right, but whose souls are attuned to Jeffersonian America, will be sympathetic to the Southern tradition and will find much in it that they will like. They might not like Southerners, but they'll like what they find as far as principle. They have as much right to identify with that tradition as did those Northerners who, up to 1860, persistently voted Southerners into positions of leadership in Washington. The Confederacy of 1861 had a better claim to be the legacy of the founding America than did the ruling class of the New North, which was itching to break through the constraints of the Constitution and command a centralized empire with which to compete with the great empires of Europe. But today, and this is the last point, today the centralized regime created by the Lincolnian Revolution shows signs of coming apart. I'm not the only one to say this. I don't have time to go into the contemporary literature, but many people are saying something's cracking. But perhaps it is enough to point out as evidence that secession, the one topic absolutely forbidden in Lincolnian America, is once again being discussed. See, this was the anchor of Hobbes' system, absolutely no secession. For Aristotle, it's permitted. The ritual of pledging allegiance to the flag of one nation indivisible as Bellamy pointed out, was instituted after the war to make clear to Americans what the war was about. It was about indivisibility. That's why the pledge exists. That's what it was instituted to make very clear. In other words, it was instituted to obliterate from the mind Jeffersonian America. That's not America. It was never a part of America at all. But traditions are stubborn things. And during the last decade, polls are regularly taken to register secession sentiment in America. I am old enough, and some of you, to have been around at the centennial of the war between the states. No one would have thought of a poll asking, do you think your state has a right to secede, and would you like it to secede? And no one thought that Scotland would ever be seceding from Britain, or that Britain would secede from the EU. But it happened. Or that the Soviet Union would peacefully dissolve when 15 states walked away. Little ones and big ones. In 2008, a Zogby poll found that 22% of Americans believe that, quote, any state in America has a right peaceably to secede and become an independent republic, end quote. 4 years later, public policy polling found that a quarter of Republicans who voted in the presidential election favored secession. Of Americans 18 to 29-year-old, 29% favored secession and 21% were not sure. Hispanics, 27% favored secession, especially in the Southwest, 19% not sure. Among very conservatives, 37% favored secession. Among somewhat conservative, 23%. Those classed as very liberal and those classed as merely liberal were both 13% for secession. See, they're not too interested. Blacks, 11%. 2 years later, in 2014, a Reuters poll found that 25% of Americans favored secession. That's 80 million people, about the size of Germany. In the South, it was 25%. The Rockies, 26%. The Southwest, 34%. New England, 19%. Later, a public policy poll in August of 2016, about a year ago, found that 26% of Texans would like their state to secede. Asked the same question if Hillary Clinton were president, 40% of Texans favored secession. Among Trump supporters, it was 61%. Secession sentiment seems especially strong among millennials in Europe and America. A 2015 Gallup poll found that millennials were the most supportive of a Palestinian state, and that Scottish millennials were the driving force behind their country's narrowly defeated vote on independence. American millennials strongly supported Britain's secession from the EU at 42%, and 37% favored secession of Texas from the United States. Now, what unites this new interest in secession, and this country one and indivisible, is not this or that policy, but disenchantment with the Lincolnian Hobbesian state as such. I mean, the political views of these people are all over the place. We don't know what they are exactly. What are the Hispanic? Why do they want secession? Why do people in the Rockies want it? And so on. They're frustrated with the Hobbesian regime. They're suffocating They don't have political self-government. The central government has progressively sucked political life out of the states and local communities. The ratchet of centralization has grown tighter with each turn. To use Bob, what's his name? I forgot his last name. Bob Higgs is a metaphor. The ratchet. So it's grown tighter with each turn. So the Americans are now in a mode of resistance and are instinctively recalling the right of state secession from their timeless Aristotelian Jeffersonian heritage. It's very deep, still there. All the historians telling you that it doesn't exist. And the people who've made these judgments have no idea about the history. It's just from the gut. They see the only way out is we need to do something serious here. We need to consider the thing's too big. Thank you.